On. There we go. Okay. Now I should have some kind of microphone. And I don't know. Gosh. Goodness. I'm going to turn the levels on that down so it's not quite so loud. All right. All right. So, as seems to be the case, per usual, I'm having some tech difficulties. My usual mic is not quite set up yet. I have a new computer, which was purchased in the idea that it would help me to get past some of these difficulties. I'm going to turn off the monitoring on that. So I got a new computer that was that is intended to help me overcome some of the technical problems that I was having previously, but I don't have all the things hooked up as they should quite yet. So hopefully you're not hearing that dump truck or that garbage truck that is in the alley right behind my garage right now, but you probably are, because the microphone I'm using is probably picking it up. Okay, so I'm going to wait for this loud truck in the alley to pass me by before I get started. But there's a couple items of business here before I get into some of my thoughts about Renoir. One is that my current mixed media class, this is the last week of the mixed media class. It ends on Friday. And I will be starting another 5-week class after a week break. So not next week, but the following week. This next week, the registration will be open for the next class, which will be a deep dive into working with resin. So a lot of times that we think about resin as a final coat, kind of a slick, shiny finish, but there are so many other ways that we can use it and incorporate it into artwork. There are different surfaces that we can get with it. We can make our work more three-dimensional. It can be used to adhere different kinds of materials to a surface. You can get matte finishes in addition to the usual glossy finish. So there's a lot of different ways that I'm excited to share with you about working with resin. I think a lot of people have a fear of working with resin. It's got a bad reputation, and this is epoxy resin and not poly resin. Poly resin, which boats and surfboards and other things are made out of, and artists have used in the past, is highly toxic and highly smelly. What I use is called epoxy resin, which is basically liquid plastic, and it is not nearly as toxic or smelly, and it is much easier to deal with than poly resin. So it's not something that needs to be feared. It's something that needs to be respected, and there are precautions that you need to take to make sure that you don't have problems. But it is a very exciting medium, and I would love to share everything I know about resin with you. So that is starting not this coming week. You can register this coming week, but we'll start the following week. I'm also going to be announcing on dabbleon.com, my website, a different way to interact with these classes. So some of you might not be interested in the critique, in having a one-on-one critique or interaction with me, but would be interested in watching the demonstrations. I will have a way for you to do that at a cheaper price point. I'm trying to make this as affordable and as accessible to as many of you as possible. I'd love to just be able to get this stuff out there and also make it feasible as a way for me to make a living. So I'm trying to get all the piping figured out, all the things plugged in that need to make that happen. But Keep an eye out for all these announcements. They should be coming in the next day or two, and you will be able to register for all these things starting next week. And if you would like updates about all of this information and want to make sure that you get the information, you can go to dablon.com and register for my email list. And that's probably the best way to make sure that you get all of the details about these things as they come up. All right, so I am going to jump in to what I want to talk about today. I decided that I want to talk about Renoir, and Renoir has kind of gotten a little bit of negative attention in fairly recently. I wanted to jump over here. Let me jump over to my screen. And there is actually and I'm going to do a search here. Whoops. Do a search for Renoir sucks at painting Instagram. So there's an Instagram account that I really do enjoy most of the time. That is called Renoir Sucks at Painting. One of my friends pointed this out to me. And basically what it is oh, it wants me to log in. Basically what it is it's people that go to museums and they take pictures of themselves in front of Renoir paintings, making usually cringing faces or all sorts of different things. And then they post it, and it gets posted to this account called Renoir Sucks at Painting. He is a little bit of a polarizing figure. I mean, some people really love Renoir, and some people, obviously, there are how many people that follow this account? 15.5 thousand followers on Renoir Sucks at Painting. So there's a lot of people that feel fairly strongly that he is not worth your attention. And I tend to agree, mostly, with that. And that's why I kind of get a kick out of this particular Instagram feed. That being said, I think there's something that happens with famous artists. You know, as with everybody, you know, these big, larger than life celebrity names like Picasso and Renoir, and they appear in and Degas. They appear in the history books, and they get all this attention. And that probably drives up the price of their paintings, makes them more valuable. And so people want to make them even more prestigious or more famous, so the paintings that they own have even more value and are seen as more prestigious to own. Anyway, I think there's all sorts of different mechanisms at play that make artists more or less important to art history, more or less significant in the public eye, and it doesn't always have to do with how good they are or the quality of their work. So, for example, Mona Lisa famously was stolen, and there was lots of attention in the news press about the Mona Lisa being stolen, and then eventually it was finally returned or found. And ever since, there has been much more attention paid to the Mona Lisa because of that kind of attention that it got for being stolen. So it's not necessarily that particular painting was a hugely significant work of art in the history of art and painting, but it just got a lot of attention because it was stolen. So there was this kind of tumult around or attention paid to that painting. I also think that these names, like Renoir, get picked up by museum collections, right? So they've got this artist in their collection. They want to make their collection seem important and relevant, so they want to have these big names that everybody recognizes, and then they'll put together exhibitions of their paintings in their permanent collection and write stories and papers and put them up on the wall, and anything that's on a wall in a museum feels like it's worth our attention, or that we need to look at it if we go to this museum and pay for the entrance, and we should be looking at every work of art, and every work of art that's on a museum wall is important to art history. Anyway, there's a lot of these things that kind of that hype up paintings, right? So Renoir, I think, is probably as well known as he is for some of these other reasons that have very little to do with the quality the quality of his actual artwork. So before I get into Renoir, I just wanted to kind of point this out, that A, probably not worth getting too worked up about how good or bad Renoir is. You know, to really spend time being angry at seeing a bad Renoir painting in a museum is, you know, it's not a good use of your time and care and energy, right? I have a feeling, or in fact, I can say 100%, every famous artist has made bad paintings, right? We all make bad paintings. It's just part of progress. It's part of getting better, right? Unfortunately, somebody found all of Renoir's bad paintings, and he had a lot of them. He was very prolific. Somebody found all those bad paintings and sold them to people, and they needed to create the sense of value, so they probably made them seem like they were more important works of art than they actually were. And my suspicion is that Renoir would have been better served if some of these paintings that he made were destroyed before they reached the art market. Anyway, probably blasphemous to say, but I know there are many paintings that I have made that I would be horribly embarrassed if they saw the light of day, and doubly so if they were hung in a museum someday. And famously, I think Michelangelo destroyed all of his preparatory sketches and works because he wanted nobody to know that there was a kind of ugly process of creation that resulted in his masterworks. So let's take a look at Renoir. Renoir he made some great paintings. He made some really fantastic paintings. Based on the ratio of bad to good, it's my opinion, and I have not read about Renoir, I don't know that much about him. I have been to a lot of art museums, and I've seen a lot of Renoir paintings. And from the museums that I've been to, from all the Renoir work that I have been exposed to, my feeling is that less than half of them are really good. In fact, there really are only about maybe 4 or 5 Renoir paintings, I think, that I've seen in life that I found really impressive and worth my time to look at. The rest of them, you know, typically I can see a Renoir out of the corner of my eye and kind of smile and move on. I don't think there's much there to learn, and I don't find them especially compelling to look at. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is kind of look at some of the best and worst of Renoir. I'm going to, I'm going to pull up a couple of his most famous paintings, and these two in particular I think are worth looking at. So this one, actually I'm going to pull up this one first. I think this is probably, I have some friends I've had friends over the years that have really loved this painting. It's one of his perhaps most reproduced images. And there are some very lovely things about it. So we're going to talk first. First, I'm going to get into some of the wonderful things or some of the good aspects of his work, and some things that I think we could all learn from. And I think there are aspects of even in these best paintings, I think there are indications of some trouble. And I think really what we can learn from Renoir is, I think he's a good example of how we all have these default behaviors. We all have these, you know, kind of autopilot behaviors in painting and in our whole life, right? That we can kind of get into, and without thinking, we kind of just put them out there, and they're not necessarily in our best interest, or don't necessarily make for very good paintings. But first, let's take a look at some of the aspects or good aspects of this painting. So, looking at this painting, and I had hoped to get my Wacom tablet set up, but I don't have it set up, so I'm going to have to work with a trackpad here, which will not be as precise, but I'll make do. Okay, so looking at this painting, we have a few large divisions of space that are quite nice. So we have this railing up here at the top that creates kind of a fairly square shape down here at the bottom. Let me kind of do a square up from the top. So it's activating this square geometry, which is a good decision, and my suspicion is that we also have a square activated. Yep, square activated down here at the top of this bowl of, who knows, it looks like yarn, but I'm sure it's flowers and stuff. On the bottom of this square, it hits the top of the lady's hands. It goes right through the middle of the little girl's lips. So we do have some interesting, at very superficial look here, have two squares that are fairly prominently highlighted, or I use the word activated in this sense, by some of these compositional elements. This primary focal point, I would say this woman here, is put right in the middle. In this case, I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but it is starting to kind of point out some of the flaws, I think, or some of the weaknesses of his painting, and that is he tends to autopilot into some fairly bland and I think unproductive symmetry and evenness. So we've got this woman here who occupies a big portion of the compositional space and is a fairly strong vertical right here in the middle. And then she provides this dark contrast, this dark background shape, where this light shirt on the little girl really can push against and stand out. So this draws our attention down at the bottom. So I hit her first, or I shouldn't say I hit. My eyes go to her first in this lovely red hat, those saturated colors, this strong horizontal here on the railing, and she's right in the center. And then I travel down and look at this little girl who is making eye contact, breaking the fourth wall with the painting in kind of an interesting way. So there's a nice feeling about the image. It's it's got this impressionist vocabulary that's really pleasing and atmospheric, and there's a nice pattern of brushwork and mark making that I think is quite nice. The thing that I feel like I've learned from Renoir, and that I really have enjoyed about some of his paintings, is the contrast that he creates between these kind of ephemeral, airy, atmospheric, impressionist dots, this kind of pattern of dots in the background that was kind of a signature of Monet and a lot of the Impressionists. Sort of these little dabs of paint and color that start to create this sense of kind of a vibration or a movement or energy in the background, kind of an ambient buzz in the context. And then in the foreground, in these faces and in the flowers on the hat and in these objects in this dish, he has more linear, like sharp-edged marks, right? So there's more of these lines, and unfortunately this is not a very good reproduction of this image. But these lines, if you could see them in greater detail, are very sharp, and there's kind of this higher focus on in the way he's applying paint in these foreground objects and in these focal points. Now, I don't know if that was intentional or just a byproduct of him painting more and resolving more these areas in the faces that he was personally more interested in, or that he wanted to be more prominent in the painting, right? So I don't know if it was an intentional decision to make these lines more poppy, more vivid. They're longer, they're not kind of little dabs of paint, they're more linear, they're sharper edged, they're not as fuzzy and broken up. So there's kind of an intensity and contrast that happens often in like floral arrangements, hats, and eyes and facial features. And again, this is perhaps not the greatest example, but you can see this especially if you get a good resolution image in the hat on this little girl. There's a difference in the quality of the rendering and use of paint that really is a great way to lock you in to that part of the painting, right? So next to all this fluffy paint application in the background, there's that really intense or more defined area in the foreground. All right, so I wanted to, let's go back to the browser. Now I'm going to pull this one up and hopefully, because, so let's go back to that. That didn't like this image. Let me open up image in a new tab and see if I can get that to cooperate. All right. Nope. All right. Let me do this. I'm going to do a screen grab of it. So this is one of the two Renoir paintings that you're likely familiar with. And let's give that a try. Okay, that worked. And this is actually not a bad reproduction. Okay, so this is kind of a social scene, a restaurant, a lot of people, and one of Renoir's perhaps more well-known paintings. It is not a painting that I am particularly fond of, and I'll explain why. But I did want to point out again that notice the way he treats these glasses, the fruit on the table, the flower on this woman's hat, the fur on the dog, some of the food, and the fabric on the table. Again, it's that kind of sharper line, the sense that it's more in focus. It's more kind of graphic in that you don't have these kind of fuzzy atmospheric marks that are happening in the distant background. Even on some of the people and some of the clothing, there still is that kind of atmospheric, fuzzy, impressionistic dot making. And then here in this foreground area with the flower, the fur, the glassware, and some of the berries and stuff, there's just a higher resolution or kind of a stronger visual vocabulary. So I think that, if anything, is my favorite part of Renoir, is that kind of tension. And it's kind of an interesting way to think about creating emphasis or focal point, right? And it's almost like something that you would expect from, I mean, it seems like a reference perhaps to photography, how things get less defined and blurry because of natural laws of light, the depth of field and lenses. Things that aren't in focus have, obviously a very particular look, and then as things get more in focus, and this is with our eyes as well, obviously they feel more significant because we can see what they are. It's like we're choosing, the artist is telling us what to focus on, right? What to focus our eyes on. So I think there is something to be learned from that. With this painting, and I'm going to go back to the other painting as well in just a second, I just think that, I don't know, I'm trying to find nice things to say about Renoir before I kind of dig into some of the things that I think are negative. There is, as with a lot of Impressionist work, there is this very soft, light, kind of a psychological, emotional, I don't know, there's a softness to that, kind of a congenial, easy, palatable kind of image making here. The time of day, the color palette, the brushwork, it's all very kind of lovely and gentle. So maybe there is just generally kind of a feeling about Renoir's work that people respond to. They're very vanilla. They don't really challenge you that much. There's not a whole lot to really love or hate. There's just kind of nice ambiance, right? It's a friendly atmosphere. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can like painting for that reason alone. And I think perhaps that is enough for us to like or dislike or feel like something is worth looking at. Okay, so I think those two things, ambiance and this issue of using different kinds of paint application to create areas of emphasis that push against this kind of brushy, ephemeral, dotty, impressionist visual vocabulary that we're more familiar with. I'm going to pull up a couple more images that I think are examples of that I wanted to share that you might not be familiar with. One in particular, there is a little art museum on Harvard campus that you might not have heard of. I certainly hadn't. It's this tiny little building on Harvard campus. I was visiting a friend of mine one time who was going to Harvard at the time, and he didn't know much about the museum, but said that it was there, and I decided to go walk through it. It's called the Fog Museum. The cool thing about the Fog Museum is that it's the collection of a single person. So you go to museums all across the world, and these big famous museums, they tend to have kind of the usual suspects, the same 20-ish stable of famous artists, and you kind of get used to seeing the same artists over and over again. And there's similar paintings enough that it doesn't really feel like you're getting anything new. But when you go to a private collection, like the Phillips collection, which I think is in New York or Boston, I've been there before. Phillips collection, and I'm forgetting now, but there are a few around that are just collections of a single person or a single family. You get the sense of an identity. You get the sense that a person with preferences and appetites and like a real personality has collected all these images and cares about them, and it becomes kind of a portrait of that person. Anyway, the Fog Museum, this is all to say that if you ever get a chance to go to the Fog Museum, it's a really cool museum, a fantastic collection, and seeing all these works of art together gives you a sense of the personality of the person behind the collection, which I think is just fascinating. So let me pull this one into Photoshop real quick. This is a portrait by Renoir at the Fog Museum that I was just struck by. I thought it was lovely. So the anatomy of this person all feels like it's in the right place. There's a simplicity to these geometric shapes in the background. He does not get into too much detail in the figure that's in this background painting, which is good, because sometimes his figures get a little funky and distracting. But he leaves it general enough that he doesn't get into trouble or kind of rub up against his inability to render a human body. And then he's got that Renoir thing where he's creating a more kind of vivid kind of brushwork and linear brushwork in some of the detail in the face. There's a really piercing, these eyes are very piercing. The fingers look anatomically correct, and the gesture is really natural. Sometimes his gestures feel really wooden and kind of uncomfortable, like unnatural. But in this case, this feels like a really naturally posed, great, and I imagine it's a good likeness. It's got that tension between the higher focus and resolution in the face and this kind of brushy, dotty brushwork in the background. Anyway, I think this is a fantastic painting. I was very surprised and delighted to see it. There's a lot of really interesting color work happening here in these shapes in the background, but also in that impressionist way of the simultaneous contrast, having complementary colors sitting right next to each other to create that tension. And you got the yellows and purples in the jacket, and just a lot of really interesting color work. I felt like this was well worth my time, and I was pleasantly surprised to see it. He also did a couple self-portraits. He did several portraits of this man, Victor Choquette. I'm not exactly sure how to say that name. I don't know the history behind these paintings. I'm responding to them purely as as an uninformed observer as you know, somebody who makes paintings. Okay, so there was another, Renoir self-portraits. He did a couple self-portraits that are worth our time. This one in particular, I think, is quite lovely. And I'm going to pull that up. Okay, so this actually doesn't have a lot of the hallmark features of an impressionist painting. It's kind of just more of a straightforward painting, but I think it's quite nice. It's soft, gentle. There's a nice light and personality. There's kind of interesting, weird shapes in the negative space that flatten out in a cool way. I don't know if that was intentional or not. Again, the anatomy is not too bad. The ear sits a little bit too high on the head, maybe a little high on the head. I mean, a lot high on the head. So there is some anatomical problems that are unfortunately quite common in Renoir paintings. But I thought this was, a decent painting. I'd stop to take a look at this one. All right, so just looking back at a couple of this one I think is dynamite. I definitely spend time with this one. This one's okay. We're going to talk a little bit about the negatives of that, but its size, I think it's a fairly large painting, so maybe its size is part of its charm or worth, but I could live without it. And then this one I actually think is quite lovely and worth our time, kind of for the reasons that I was talking about. Okay, so let's talk now. It's 11:35. Okay, I spent more time than I thought I was going to on the good parts of Renoir. Now, the bad parts of Renoir and these kind of default or autopilot behaviors that I think a lot of us are guilty of getting caught by, myself included. These have to do with, more than anything, I think most relevant to us, or I think maybe the most instructive default behavior is his tendency to evenly distribute visual information. So in negative space, in the background, where he's just kind of got miscellaneous tree, plant shapes, maybe a little bit of architectural shapes, but just kind of filler imagery in the background, which happens, right? Sometimes it's not so important that we are very literal in representing what's in the context of a painting, especially in a portrait like this, where we just need to know that she's sitting somewhere, right? Maybe the city or architectural cues aren't really that important. So we just have kind of general plant and architectural information in the background. So when that is the situation, a lot of times, a lot of us are guilty of just evenly distributing stuff, right? So what I mean, let me see if I can find some good examples of this. So in the background here, we've got this line right there, kind of the same width and same color as that. This looks like an architectural element of some kind, a pole or a building, and then this is a tree trunk. And then look at this. On the opposite side, almost symmetrically, there's these two lines that are the same color. Those two lines are this dark kind of umbre color. Those two, they're also the same width, same color. They don't continue down, so we don't get a sense of what they are. They're just kind of, again, kind of general information and background. But the way these two lines are the exact same distance apart, and the fact that they're identical, and then they create this symmetry across the composition, where it's kind of they're the exact same. It kind of just makes me think, well, it definitely makes me think that he's just on autopilot, right? He's just kind of sticking stuff in there, and he's just got this tendency to make lines that are that thick, and this is kind of what the background looks like when I'm not really caring and I'm just kind of putting stuff out there, right? Up here in the foreground, we have these nice little lines, organic lines happening that look like vines maybe. And here he's actually getting some interesting variety, right? Some of the vines are closer together, some of them are further apart. There's variety there. There's a lot of really cool stuff to kind of get involved in. So there is kind of that aspect of Impressionism where they are repeating that dot brushwork. So maybe that's part of it, but also look at the trees in the background. They've just all these dots that represent the green leaves on the trees are the same size of dot, and they're all fairly evenly distributed. There's just kind of this general fuzz of dots, rather than what we would expect to see in a tree, where you'd have some clumps, some big clusters of leaves and some smaller cluster leaves, some closer together, some further apart. There's an evenness to the distance between these elements in the background, right? He's just kind of filling stuff in, and the problem with that is that it's not making use of negative space to accentuate or strengthen the visual statement, right? He could be doing so much more with that negative space to reinforce this foreground figure, to point us to her, to frame her, and also he could be doing so much more just to create a more variety in that visual information in the background. And when you have this kind of evenly distributed visual information, it starts to feel just like mush, right? Just like white noise in the background. And it contradicts our sense of what a natural or believable environment would look like. Because nature doesn't distribute things like that. It does a city with buildings and foreshortening and linear perspective, and it doesn't have that kind of consistently spaced visual information. So I think that is one of the default behaviors that I think he is most guilty of, and why I think his paintings are largely boring and not really worth your time. I just don't think he's trying that hard to really be intentional how he's using every square inch of his composition. The same here. Notice here in the background, he's got this tree, which is the same width as this tree, which is, overlapping that tree in the background. So it should be, usually it would be a little bit bigger. And that's the same width as this tree, and they're kind of evenly spaced. The negative space in between those trees is about the same. So it's like this, it's almost like in Photoshop, he's cloned that tree 3 times. So instead of using that pattern of trees, and they might be the same tree, they might be the same size, but as it recedes into space, that tree should get smaller, and it's very unlikely that those trees would be evenly separated horizontally and in space, right? And they're all the same color, and they're all kind of the same clustering of leaves. In the background, the way he's separating these boats out, the sails are kind of the same direction, they're kind of symmetrical shapes. This kind of even distribution of all these little lines, it just feels like he wasn't thinking about placing things in a deliberate way to evoke this kind of general sense of the greenery and how that, those bushes and volumes of leaves existed in space. He's just kind of putting this white noise in the background, right? The other thing that I think about this painting that is often true of Renoir is it's just this mass of people, right? There's a lot of different things he could do to tell us what we're supposed to be looking at, what's important here. And maybe you could say that it's just, he wants us to just to consume it all at once, right? He wants it just to be kind of this general atmosphere, which I could buy, but then he's got these things like this woman here who's got these 2 little beady black eyes looking at us, and she's breaking the 4th wall. She's making eye contact with the viewer, so she kind of feels like she might be important, but she's not in the foreground. He's kind of created this halo around her where everything is kind of equidistant from her, hands and faces. He's kind of got this space he's created around her, so I kind of feel like I should be paying attention to her. She's making eye contact with me, so that's kind of grabbing my attention. She's also looks like a little bit more refined. And then he's got this face that's that light skin surrounded by all that dark that kind of pops out. And these colors down here that pop out in a distracting way because of the high contrast. There's a lot of things he could do just to refine that, to push some of that contrast back so other things can be privileged or emphasized more. and clarified. So seems like he's kind of implying a story here, but he's not really following through, right? So if I'm supposed to be paying attention to her, well, how does she relate to these figures, these people in the foreground? Is there something different about her? Is she supposed to be isolated? Does she relate to these foreground figures? And foreground figures are closer to us, so we kind of have this bodily relationship to those foreground figures that make them feel more important, perhaps. They occupy more of the compositional space. So there's a lot of kind of implication with no follow-through. So it just kind of feels like a mass of bodies with no message. And I'm kind of left like, I don't really care. I'm going to walk by. I don't, again, maybe a little bit of the atmosphere. I don't care. Don't care. All right. So another thing that I wanted to point out about Renoir. Let's look back here. I'm going to go back and do just a Google search for Renoir paintings. And I'm going to bring up a couple of these things, and I'm hoping that I don't absolutely ruin Renoir for you. But once you see it, you can't really unsee it. So let's look at this painting right here. So notice in the background that there is more distance here between the sky and the horizon line than there is over here. And granted, there is a little bit of land mass there to account for that. But also notice that there is kind of a diagonal happening up, right? So it looks like his composition is tilted just a little bit to the left. Now, look at these figures down at the bottom. These figures that are balanced, they're standing still. So the general gesture, the overall mass of that figure should be fairly straight up and down, right? That's what balance is with gravity. But, this figure is leaning a little bit to the left, maybe a little bit unnaturally. Now you could say he's leaning back, okay, maybe. But then this figure who's standing straight up and down, a little bit of contrapposto, but still the mass should generally be straight up and down, is tilted a little bit to the left. And so is this. Notice how they're evenly spaced, again, default, kind of evenly distributing visual information. Also look at these boats. They're all kind of, fairly evenly spaced, even negative space between them, right? So just kind of, he's just kind of unimaginative, and he's got this tendency to lean things a little bit to the left. Now, all of us have a little bit of a bias to one side or the other because of the way, whether we're right-handed or left-handed. My suspicion is that Renoir is right-handed because I do the same thing. When I'm drawing figures, it is more natural for my arm to draw a pencil at a diagonal, slight diagonal, instead of straight up and down, right? It's just the anatomy, right? My elbow has to come in, and I have to pull straight down to get that straight vertical, right? Same with the horizon line. To get a perfect horizontal, it's kind of going against the natural way my arm and shoulder want to work. To get that perfect horizontal, I kind of have to dip my elbow in again and be very careful not to pull up, right? So my suspicion is that another default behavior that we need to be aware of is he's tilting everything a little bit to the left because he's right-handed, right? We all do it. We all have bodies that have limitations and natural, movement. But that is something that you need to, you got to take care of that, Renoir. You got to be aware of everything leaning a little bit to the left. And if you look at a lot of his paintings, in fact, you start to see this little bias, everything tilting a little bit to the left. This would be another example of that. Again, so this little girl, she's standing still. She's got her, everything's. It feels like should be straight up and down, but there is this kind of right tilt, and the way she is sitting, her feet on the path, everything about her just feels a little bit tilted to the left, and the way these flowers are oriented. Now, it could be that the pathway and the scoop of, the way that those flowers are planted in the garden, they kind of, everything is kind of believable, but then you start just seeing this little bit of tilt everywhere to the left, right? You look at enough paintings and you think, he just wasn't accommodating or accounting for that or compensating for that. And again, it's my suspicion that he didn't really care. And that's kind of my thought about Renoir, is that he probably just didn't really care. He wasn't really pushing himself that hard, in my opinion. And he just kind of got into these default behaviors, and maybe what he was focusing on was less about really getting good at rendering figures and representing things, and just kind of enjoyed the activity of it and enjoyed being in autopilot. All right, the last thing that I wanted to discuss about Renoir and why people don't will often kind of give him a hard time is he just was not a good figure drawer. His anatomy is just atrocious. So in a lot of his paintings, the eyes are just a little bit, especially the eyes. He does not have a really good command on foreshortening. So when I turn to this side a little bit, and this eye is further away from you than this eye, it's going to get narrower because it's curving away from you, and it's also further away, right? And he kind of does that here, but it looks a little bit too straight on, so it's going a little Picasso on us, right? The simultaneous perspective where it looks like we're looking at this eye straight on and this eye straight on, and it doesn't really feel like it's following the curvature of the face in a natural way. So a lot of times, and this one is guilty of that as well. Let's look at this little girl again. So this little girl, something going on with her eyes. They feel a little bit cross-eyed, and that's true of a lot of his paintings. The figures can start to feel a little bit cross-eyed. Let's look at, so here, not as prominent, but again, there's just, this back eye should be narrower, should be like not as wide because it's following the curvature of the face. That shouldn't be, they look like, again, he's looking at this eye from straight on, and he's not getting that kind of naturalistic foreshortening. This face, the distance between the bridge of the nose and the eye here is off. It just doesn't, it looks like she's got a misshapen head. And really, if you go through a lot of his paintings, the eyes especially are problematic. So looking at this image, the eyes on this woman off, the anatomy of this face is off, the eyes on this woman, the direction is off. The baby's not so bad, but she's kind of looking straight ahead. This one, eyes, very problematic. So eyes are problematic. And then let's take a closer look at his figures. So his female nudes are guilty of the same thing that I've been talking about in other areas. He starts to, instead of really thinking about the underlying structure of the human skeleton, he kind of evenly distributes folds of skin and musculature. There's a little bit of a nod to anatomy and structure, but these things don't add up at all. So the folds of the skin and the belly of these Rubenesque women, see how they're kind of evenly spaced. Everything is, it just looks like inner tube tires, right? And the body's not like that. Nobody's body's like that. You have some folds that are bigger, some that are smaller. You do have a little bit of, evenness and consistency depending. It's not like you don't have any repetition of the same size. But all of his round shapes on the human body tend to be the same size. And again, I think he's not really paying attention. He doesn't really care about the underlying anatomy. He's just doing kind of the fill-in. This is how he does chubby parts of bodies. He just makes this consistent roundness. And then, of course, we could go all day on just talking about how the anatomy doesn't quite line up. The way that this head connects to the torso does not quite add up. This neck, again, feels more like an inner tube than it feels like a connector between those two. The way the head is tilted does not jive with that neck and the way that's foreshortened. The neck would probably be much more of a sliver, like that. I mean, it just looks like, a lot of his figures look like they have goiter, like a big protrusion, a little, like a bulb growth out of the side of their head. So the neck would probably be more foreshortened, and then, her shoulder would not be that far out. You got these kind of linebacker shoulders going on. The way those two shoulders then connect with the arm and the elbow. I mean, look at those massive. This arm should be, it's more in the distance, so it should be shorter. The way this elbow connects to the shoulder behind this woman's head doesn't quite add up. If she's reaching up, her shoulder would be higher. There'd be more foreshortening there as that arm goes away and this arm wraps around. Anyway, I could just go on and on about his human bodies are atrociously proportioned, not in a good way. Michelangelo famously attenuated a lot of his figures, so they were just felt longer, stretched out. That was on purpose. He actually wrote about that. There's a reason, kind of symbolically and aesthetically, why he chose to do that. It wasn't because he just wasn't very good at drawing figures. So if it felt intentional, if it felt like it was a decision for a reason that he had these distortions and inaccuracies and kind of poorly rendered aspects of his figures, if it felt intentional, then that's one thing. But in this case, it just felt like he wasn't a very good figure drawer, and he just needed to spend more time and try a little harder. And I think for me, again, this is my personal opinion, that kind of describes a lot of Renoir's work. Feels kind of lazy. Feels like he did it just, was interested in just turning his brain off and painting without thinking too much about it. And he could have just spent more time with figure drawing. All right, so I think that is it. Let's skip out here back front. All right, so that is Renoir. I'll say it again. I don't think it's worth your time and effort getting too worked up about why Renoir is in museums. And if you love Renoir, fantastic. Go take a look. Enjoy it. There's nothing wrong with that. But realize that with a lot of artists, a lot of famous artists, there's a lot of different reasons why they are important to the history of art that aren't necessarily that their paintings are fantastic, right? There's a lot of reasons why they're up on that museum wall. And also, there's a lot of reasons why bad paintings by good artists get shown on museum walls, right? So just because it's hanging on a museum wall doesn't mean it's good painting, doesn't mean it's worth your time. This is one of the things I would love to teach, just about how to go to an art museum and not come away overwhelmed and annoyed. When you go to an art museum, just walk through real fast once and just take note of where your eye gets attracted to, right? Just naturally what you tend to gravitate towards. And then the second time you go through the museum, just spend time with those things where your eye was attracted to, and just let yourself ignore the other stuff, right? You don't have enough time when you go to every museum to look at every piece for the exact same amount of time, and they don't deserve equal attention. All right, so one more thing that I wanted to say before I move on here. If you want my opinion, and nobody can tell me no, so I'm going to give it. But if you're looking for some Rubenesque figures that are much more worth your time, look at Degas. Degas knows Degas figures. So Degas, he does these bathers and women in, you know, different poses and dancers, and some of them are very, you know, not very rigid or highly detailed or resolved. They have these impressionist kind of marks. He does a lot with chalk pastel that are quite lovely. So don't waste your time with Renoir and his figures. Go look at Degas. There's a lot more there to learn from, and he was much more rigorous in getting the anatomy right. Pierre Bonnard was another person from that era of painting, Impressionist era. And his figures have some anatomical problems, but his composition and his use of color and pattern are so much more interesting, so much more fun to look at, so much more challenging, and feel so much more intentional. So you can see here the way that a head is attached to the body is problematic. The arm is kind of, again, that hand's not looking so good, looks more like a paw. And the figures are kind of more rigidly posed sometimes. So sometimes Bonnard, his figures aren't great, but his colors, his patterns, the way he divides up space is just a lot more idiosyncratic, a lot more interesting, and feels a lot more intentional. So Bonnard's worth your time, Degas is worth your time, and then Mary Cassatt. She's got a lot of the same kind of vocabulary, again, of the Impressionists, and her paintings are anatomically fantastic. They're so much more interesting, so much better rendered, and the arrangement of her figures and negative space, the way she uses composition is far superior to anything Renoir ever did. So there you go. If you want suggestions, don't waste your time with Renoir. Go take a look at Mary Cassatt, Pierre Bonnard, or some of Degas' pastel sketches. And you'll learn more and I think have a more impactful experience. All right, so that's enough with Renoir. I've gone enough on Renoir. Those are all my opinions. And if you would like to have your images critiqued, I will not be nearly as harsh on you as I was on Renoir. And you can email me your images of your work to dabbleon@gmail.com. I would prefer that you send work that you are either currently working on, so works in progress, or work that you have recently finished. I love the idea that we are sharing the work that is present and that we're currently invested in. I think there's a lot of inspiration and motivation that could be drawn from that. And anybody is welcome to submit work. I'd love to take a look at your work and talk about it. And again, if you're interested in classes, I have a class on resin, using resin in art, coming up, not next week, but the following week. If you're interested, go to dabbleon, dabbleon.com, to sign up for my email list so you get all the information when it comes out. And I will have information on subscriptions and other ways to access the content that isn't necessarily taking the full class. If you are interested in participating but don't feel like you have the time to really commit to a full class. And with that, I will close my comments for today, and hopefully I'll have a better microphone set up for you next week. Hopefully this was all, hopefully the sound worked and everything got across to you. It was a lot of fun to talk about Renoir. And with that, I will sign off and see you all next week, 11 a.m. PST, Thursday, and send me your images.